This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law Podcast, brought to you by Digital Law and produced by Anson Evaluate. As a bit of background, we're a law firm that works solely on technology, cybersecurity, and legal issues. And in each episode, we look at stories in the law related to digital technology from around the world, with a specific emphasis on data protection and cybersecurity. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice list at Digital Law UK, and I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright. We're going to be running through some stories that have been coming up this week, some really key fundamental stories, I'd say, Peter. So I'll let you introduce yourself and then we'll get started.
Yeah, my name's Peter. I'm a solicitor and managing director at Digital Law, and you'd think we might be running out of things to talk about during the middle of August, it being the silly season and everyone being on holiday, but turns out no, we've got some quite significant things to discuss. So I'll pass back to you, Amelia, to kick us off.
Thanks, Peter. So we are starting our podcast in Northern Ireland now. So the names of police officers and staff in Northern Ireland were where they were based and their roles were published on the internet. So, I mean, there are a lot of red flags already here. So this is continuing the threats against officers from distant Republicans, and they must be extremely vigilant about their personal security on a good day. And like you said, Peter, this really couldn't have happened to a worse country, realistically.
Indeed, given that you have all these separate police forces across the UK, the police service of Northern Ireland is probably the one that's most at risk. You've mentioned their dissident Republicans. I'm afraid I'm of the generation that I grew up with regular reports on the news each night of terrorist incidents and atrocities in Northern Ireland. It's not that bad now, but you still occasionally hear of police officers just being deliberately targeted because they are police officers and either being assaulted or murdered. And it's the way that you say you used to have those sort of dissident Republican issues with the IRA, and very often you've still got organised crime embedded in the community as a legacy of that, of the terrorist past in the 20th century. And so as a result, I'd say you've got officers who are more at risk from quite violent threats and assault in Northern Ireland, and now we've just said, and this is where they all live.
Yeah.
So, yeah, from that point of view, I mean, if this had happened and we were saying, oh, well, we've published the details of all of the home addresses of the Northumberland police, well, that wouldn't be great, but you haven't got the threats to the safety and security of all those officers in Northumberland in the way that you do in a place like Northern Ireland, regrettably. So, I mean, we're probably going to end up mentioning this a few times during this podcast, but when you're looking at the criteria where the UK Information Commissioner says, do we need to be notified of this? Will we potentially investigate and look at enforcement? Their main criteria is on two headings. One is, does the breach lead to affect the rights and freedoms of the data subjects involved? And in this instance, yes, it does. Does the data breach does it basically lead to a risk to the data subjects involved? Yes, it does, strongly on both instances. So just a really serious breach here. And we're already now starting to see some of the consequences of that with the information that was breached now appearing elsewhere online and in the physical world. So it's the fact this information is now in the public domain, and it's almost like we wait with bated breath to see the real implications of such a massive breach of information and how it could lead to quite dangerous consequences.
So in terms of how this information came about, so the data was made public in error by police as they were responding to a routine FOI request. And so this FOI request was then submitted via a Excel spreadsheet. And we're not talking about, your bog standard, we're talking about a large scale Excel spreadsheet here. And this was then published online, and it was kept up for 2.5 hours before it was removed on PSNI's request, which was when they became aware of it.
Yeah. So the issues, I mean, first of all, it's difficult to imagine, having all of that information, a massive spreadsheet with all that information on, and that being, we have all of this data on all of our staff. and just putting it all in one massive spreadsheet almost seems to be a risk waiting to happen. Now, I don't know if it's sometimes a recurring thing across the public sector, where sometimes the sort of the default setting is we have a load of data, let's put it into a spreadsheet rather than putting it into anything else that doesn't then generate as default this massive sort of data dump. What do I mean by that? Well, it turned out that when at the start of the COVID pandemic, all of the test results for all of the people who were taking tests for COVID in the UK, that was all going into just one massive spreadsheet maintained by the UK Department of Health. And you can imagine how quickly that leads to a problem when you're then relying on data entry from spreadsheets probably being shared and opened in multiple locations, and the practicalities of that data being properly updated, and B, just the security implications of that, you dread to think. So in this instance, it's actually even worse because, surely you would think that if you've got all of that personal data, let's not forget here, COVID tests is one thing. Would that necessarily have been personal data? Well, not necessarily. You could anonymize that information to a certain one. But here we've got all of the personal data related to service personnel in police service in Northern Ireland. And surely you'd be thinking, hang on, this is personal data. It's going to contain people's home addresses, contact information, a lot of sensitive personal, well, not necessarily the strict definition of sensitive personal data, but personal data full stop. And surely you'd think, principles of data minimization, principles of minimizing risk as a whole, putting all of that information together on one spreadsheet, or even generating that information from it being held somewhere else and putting it into one spreadsheet and just having it available out there, so that if it ends up being misused in this way, it's just needlessly creating a high risk. And it doesn't really fill you with confidence if that's indicative of general working practices within the administration of the force.
No, not at all. And I think one of the key bits we've not touched on yet is the fact that it was up for 2.5 hours. So if you have got such a large file, as we all know, uploading a large file will take ages.
Yeah.
And so surely someone would have maybe noticed this when trying to upload this massive document.
Yeah.
Or even at least then, if they didn't when it was first uploaded and completed, that, maybe before 2.5 hours, someone might have noticed that actually, wait, there's a problem here. We've got the names and I believe it's the surname and first initial of every employee, their rank or grade, where they are based, the unit they work in, including surveillance and intelligence. You think, correctly,
Wow.
Let's just double check on this.
Exactly. And the thing is here as well, this is also indicative of failing to properly look at information that's being disclosed as a pursuant to a Freedom of Information Act request or a data subject access request. We end up advising a lot of clients on the handling of these sorts of requests. And the problem that comes into play is that sometimes there is this sort of tunnel vision that administrators get when they're handling these requests, that they have sort of started from a point of a maximum point of saying, well, we want to end up disclosing all of this information. And you then have to make sure that it is redacted, that it doesn't contain any personal data. Well, how's that working out for you? But the whole idea is that you then have, and particularly with FOI, there's a whole raft of information that you mustn't disclose. So, for example, is it commercial, confidential information? Third party, is it legally privileged? There's so many issues you have to go through. And
not to mention, there are exemptions. You don't always have to respond to FOIs.
You don't have to necessarily respond, and sometimes you end up looking and thinking, look, by the time we've gone through and thoroughly redacted this, we aren't actually disclosing anything meaningful, and therefore you have to go back to the requester and say, I'm sorry, we pursuant to your request and given all of these things that we then have to not disclose to you. There's nothing meaningfully that we can. Particularly with a DSI, you can turn around and say, well, look, under Article 15, we're still going to tell you what we've collected where that goes, how we do it, why we do it, you just aren't necessarily going to get, the black and white, here is a copy of your data, as it were, because that might not be practical. With an FOI, it's always a matter of being very tailored in terms of what, and it's not a matter of, give them a whole document, it's like information. So that information that's been requested might only be a small part of a document, not something in its totality. In this instance, they weren't supposed to be disclosing, of course, all of the personal data related to every single employee. They shouldn't have been disclosing any personal data at all. It seems this thing was uploaded in error, but that they've ended up disclosing this almost as a, certainly, I don't think it was necessarily sort of metadata, but certainly it was something uploaded to the system in error. As you say, surely the fact you would be able to upload that easily should have been a bit of a red flag. But the thing is, as well, we sometimes find that people dealing with these sorts of communications and with these sort of admin features are very often quite junior. We helped one client with a data protection breach a few weeks back, and the problem was caused by it being a new starter who didn't know what they were doing, who rushed it, who clicked through a requester that came up saying, "Are you sure you want to do this?" To which they went, "Yes," and it caused a breach. So I'm sure that when they're looking at this, there will be multiple things where this could have been prevented and it still happened. So it's very often not actually an issue with systems as such. It's probably just the as usual. It's the organic thing behind the inorganic living tissue behind the terminal and pressing the keystrokes that unfortunately has been at fault. That's probably led to this.
Also, well, that is the explanation of the Northern Ireland story. Sticking with human error and FOI requests, we are now moving to Cumbria. So the names and the salaries of every Cumbria police officer and staff member were accidentally published online. It has emerged. The force said human error led to information being wrongly uploaded to its website on the 6th of March. However, personal details, including dates of birth and addresses, were among the details not released. Wow, okay. You've half failed there. You still not quite got it right, but you do it better than Northern Ireland.
Yeah, and the thing there is that again we've got a large volume of personal data. For whatever reason, someone's ended up uploading that in error, and then that's probably stayed up there for a period as well, until someone suddenly realised, oh, that shouldn't be up there. It doesn't unfortunately here give us great confidence in the sort of administration behind the police when they obviously have huge amounts of sensitive data to handle on a daily basis, and then you think, well, wow, you can't actually handle the data related to your own staff efficiently here. I almost wonder, is part of this as well the fact that we have 30 or 40 odd different police forces across England and Wales. So you've got the Met, which is the big one in London, and you've then got these smaller regional forces like the Cumbria one. So every single police force will have its own HR systems, its own payroll, its own training records, its own records of suspects and witnesses and suspects, witnesses, defenders, all this sort of information, victims. Each one will have its own systems to look after this. And obviously some forces are given more of a budget than others. Some will have fewer resources to put into systems and also the education and training for administrators to make sure this doesn't happen. And you do, to a certain point, start to think, well, wouldn't it make more sense? I mean, there is a police national computer, PNC, that is the thing that records all of the convictions and cautions that each person who comes into contact with the police has their information recorded on. But clearly here, that doesn't contain information like who's employed by force. That's a separate system, which the Cumbria Constabulary will have for themselves. Same thing, police service in Northern Ireland. You do wonder, wouldn't having a unified source work? But then you think, look at the public sector's great tradition of big IT projects like that coming in massively over budget and behind schedule. Very often not doing their system. I'm really sorry, folks. I've been quite negative today, and I really can't get out of it. But it's that this doesn't really give us a great, as I say, great confidence in the way that these forces are operating. And unfortunately, the idea of any significant change or reform is always going to be very expensive as well. So what do you do?
Sticking with the very somber mood in relation to the police, we are now in Norfolk and Suffolk. They have also had a data breach, but this time we are looking at victims and witness detail leaks. So the data leaked here includes personally identifiable information on victims, witnesses and suspects, as well as descriptions of offences. And in terms of the offences, this is in relation to domestic incidents, sexual offences, assaults, thefts and hate crime. And just with the cherry on top, the Information Commissioner's Office has been notified. I mean, so at least here we are looking at there being a technical issue instead of human error, and we are looking here in terms of victims and witnesses. So we are not talking about kind of police officers here. We're talking about vulnerable people.
But this is the point as well, where we're almost going into that this is sensitive category data at this point, because you're talking about
you've got hate crime. Well, that could be based on ethnic background or your sexual orientation, anything of that sort of kind of crime.
And you could have people who are, as it says, suspects, witnesses who've said, look, I will help the police with this, and that information being published when you really would not have wanted that to be published, given the threats that are often made to witnesses to stop them giving witness evidence. So again, this is the sort of thing that acts as a bit of a disincentive then for people to come forward and help the police when you aren't even going to keep my data safe. So that really doesn't help from that perspective. And again, it's quite a high volume here, isn't it? It's 1,200 people that has ended up being done. And this again is pursuant to an FOI request there, isn't it?
Yeah, I feel like there's a flag here saying that people, specifically the police, but people need more training on how to respond to an FOI request.
Yeah.
What should be in there? What are the protocols? What needs to be followed? And how best to deal with these, because clearly the current training or regime that certainly the police are following does not work.
And it's interesting if we sort of stand back and look at the consequences of FOI legislation. This was brought in 2000, and interestingly, in his memoir, former Prime Minister Tony Blair ended up, a lot of things that happened during his 10 years in office, which we'll draw a veil over. But when he then says, out of everything he did, he feels that one of his biggest regrets was introducing the Freedom of Information Act. As I say, we aren't even going to talk about the other things that happened during those 10 years. And to be honest, I don't think any Prime Minister for the last 70 years really can look back and say that their period in office was an unalloyed joy. So, but the point I'm making is that out of all the different things happened over that 10-year period, 97 to 2007, if he's pointing and saying this was a real problem, it's because I think of the unintended consequence. The unintended consequences of sensitive data like this being released, and the untold damage that causes by people not responding to requests properly. The administrative overhead of maintaining Freedom of Information Act teams within virtually every public sector body and authority to respond to the requests that are made. I mean, we perhaps should do a separate episode all just about FOI requests at some point, but there is a persistent feeling, I think, certainly amongst government, that this has ended up being, obviously you like the idea of openness and transparency should be a good thing to encourage, but I think the unintended consequences and the risks like this that it's brought with it are a big negative. Unfortunately, it's a genie you can't put back in the bottle, because freedom of information is an established principle in certainly the majority of democracies around the world. So if you were to then say, well, we're going to stop doing this because it's expensive, I think you would face such an outcry that you wouldn't be able to stop it. So it is now out there, and we have to deal with it. But the problems that we're coming up against, and this is probably from teams being under-resourced, people not necessarily understanding the system, not understanding the legalities around what you're actually reviewing and disclosing, is then sometimes leading to this. We know currently that as well that, of course, there's There's a million vacancies out there in the UK economy, so they can't actually recruit people and get them trained quickly enough before they then end up leaving and go doing something else. So the issue here is very often human error. People simply aren't being trained to do this well enough. I mean, the blame here is also on a technical issue, but what led to that technical issue is the thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to put, a plug in because, we are talking about FOIs. We would be more than happy to advise anybody on how to respond to an FOI request if they want to
Yes.
get in touch with us. I mean,
Yeah.
we've spent, a good proportion of this episode going on about FOIs, but we are in a unique position where we can, in fact, help you get back to these and prevent, situations and breaches like this from happening.
Yeah. And we've ended up representing both organisations responding to FOIs. We've also sometimes represented interested parties when it comes to FOI requests who've asked for certain information not to be disclosed. So, we know our way around that piece of legislation quite well. And that, therefore, when we see stories like this, where you can tell that the wrong approach has been taken to an FOI request, where they've thought, well, let's just disclose lots of information, rather than thinking, well, actually, what can we disclose safely and effectively and in a timely manner? Not to mention with regards to costs overall and what it will cost to respond to an FOI request. There are a lot of very good reasons sometimes where you can turn around and say, sorry, we simply can't respond to this. In this instance, probably would have been better to actually dig in and say, I'm sorry, we can't respond to this, if you'd known that there might be issues that might then lead to a massive breach that then follows. So sometimes having a mind to the data involved and the issues involved can then mean that you're making a more realistic decision in terms of what next action should be taken, rather than going down the route of, well, we have to try and review and disclose, and then sometimes leading to further problems. This isn't to say that you shouldn't respond to FOI requests. It's just saying that you use the legislation to make sure that you are disclosing what you should or should not be doing, and using your resources in a proportionate, reasonable manner.
Thanks, Peter. So now, kind of moving away from human error and FOI, we are now going to be looking at breach. So, we're not looking good in the UK at the moment. So, I feel like that's putting it very, very bluntly. So we're next looking at the electoral roll. So the UK's elections watchdog has revealed that it's been the victim of a complex cyber attack, potentially affecting millions of voters. So, for our non-UK listeners, Peter, are you able to just explain what the electoral roll is?
So the electoral roll is the thing that dictates who receives a ballot paper and has the ability to vote in an election. Not just general election, this is also things like local authority, local council elections, referendums. All these things are dependent on your information being on the electoral roll. So that's not everyone in the country, because of course, below the age of 18, you can't vote.
That's quite true, but you can actually register to vote at the age of 16.
You can, and I know that also I think in Scotland they've wanted to introduce voting at 16 on certain things.
Yeah, so
and I know they do have to have your data and get in touch.
Yeah, so potentially we're looking at a slightly broader range of data even from what you might first think.
I mean, it was quite a weird day for me when there was one year when there was quite a close fought general election, and at aged 18, I got a birthday card from one of the candidates saying, "Happy birthday, make sure you use your vote." All handwritten, not at all in a sinister way at all. But clearly they were watching and thinking, someone who's 18, maybe just the fact that I've written to them will mean that they vote for me. That I wouldn't stop and think about, well, I might look at their policies and what's best for the country. Anyway, but the point is, so the electoral roll is this quite important thing. It is managed here by the Electoral Commission, which is a quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organisation, otherwise known as a Quango, that then oversees the use of that role and then the operation of the elections. For those of us who might be stationed listening to us overseas, so this isn't like in the US where you've got, you can vote online or there's the risk sometimes of elections in an electronic form being compromised. Here, this is just the information that means you're then mailed a paper ballot. The majority of people in the UK still vote in person, so you're then sent the paper card which you then take along, and you're then given your ballot paper, and then you cast your vote in a polling station, or you're on the electoral roll and you've said, I'd like a postal ballot, and then you get a postal ballot, and then you have to return that in advance of election day. So it's all still done by paper, which we're seen as quite Byzantine in that way in the UK. But at least then it means, in theory, that you can't get hacked by, by a foreign state that could interfere in your election.
And there we go. There's that in theory. So the Electoral Commission's said unspecified hostile actors had managed to gain access to the copies of the electoral register from August 2021.
Yes.
So hackers also broke into its email and control systems, but the attack was not discovered until October last year. So the watchdog has warned people to watch out for unauthorized use of their data. And I mean, what sort of data are we looking at here in terms of the electoral roll?
So this is basically names, addresses, date of birth that confirms if you can be on the roll. There's also going to be information that might mean that you're not on the roll. So, for example, if you're in prison, you can't vote. So that would mean that your name is then removed from the roll. So, you're talking about quite sensitive data. The other information that could be on there is that you have to, if you've got a postal vote, you also have to submit your signature. So, and there's always controversy over sometimes, your signature has changed. So does that mean that the same person is voting or not? The wonderful world of electoral fraud is, again, probably a subject for another podcast. But the point is that so you could have large volumes of signatures for the postal ballot part of the electoral register as well. There's also several registers. There's like the open public register, and then there's the one where you've said, I do not want the electoral, my information to be shared with sort of advertising and marketers and third-party agencies. Though that information then is still very often then shared with, for example, credit reference agencies.
Oh yeah, they have to at least purchase it. They have to jump through that one extra hurdle because that's obviously going to hold them back.
Yeah.
And so it's specifically here, this has been breached, even the details from the open register. So that means you are literally talking about everybody here and the additional details that you can find in the open register there.
Yeah.
So all in all, we're not looking so good here, because as well, while obviously predominantly this is based on UK voters, the data accessed also include the names, but not the addresses of overseas voters as well. So we're not just talking about UK residents.
No, we've got those people in Gibraltar as well.
Yes, absolutely.
And other various overseas territories where they count. As well as those who just live overseas and can vote anyway, of which is quite a large number. And then, interestingly, in terms of where this information has gone, it is suspected that this has been as a result of hackers from, let's say, I was going to say from from another nation state, from Russia. It is suspected.
Right.
They've been hacked by the Russians. So, as we say, does this mean they can hack the next UK general election, which will be due in 2024? No, but it's given them rather a lot of intelligence about the size, makeup, demographics of the UK electorate. And if you wanted to influence that electorate in other ways, for example, if you're on that postal ballot, more often than not, you've got to put in an email address as well, so they can contact you like that. So then if they wanted to use those email addresses to then send information to you that could try and disinform you about things, that's how they do it.
Well, I mean, ultimately as well, you can use the standard email phishing, click here on this link and,
of course,
simple, efficient.
Yeah.
And likely those who will be using the postal vote may well be vulnerable people, which are more likely to then...
why they couldn't get to the polling station in the first place.
Precisely.
And the thing is as well here is that this is the UK does have the UK National Cyber Security Centre, which is the arm of the sort of security services GCHQ that is involved in theory trying to keep systems safe and secure. But in this instance, usually they say, look, we try and keep UK infrastructure, critical infrastructure like this, safe, and that's therefore a major failing. So it doesn't really give a great message to the UK's security partners when a major piece of infrastructure and an asset like the electoral register has been compromised, unfortunately.
So that was our last discussion for this episode, and hopefully, potentially, our next episode is a little bit more uplifting, less doom and gloom. But I mean, don't count on it. We're not doing so well at the moment, are
we? we're trying. We're trying.
Maybe we'll add in some stuff about X, formerly known as Twitter, to just lighten things up a bit.
Yeah, let's get back to Elon Musk cage fighting. I think that's what we'd be much more lighter next week.
But if you would like to hear more from us, including subscribing to our newsletter, as well as receiving information about subscriber-only podcasts and webinars, then please subscribe to our premium via our Patreon channel using the link in the show notes. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this podcast. And if you would like to produce your own podcast or webinar, or you'd be interested to hear more about Anson Evaluate services, please take a look at their website that you can find at www.ansonevaluate.com. Just to let you know, these episodes are available on our website, YouTube channel, podcast channels as well, such as Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, Google Podcasts, basically anywhere you find your podcast at this point. Please feel free to leave us a review. If you do have any questions about what we've talked about today, please email us at admin@digitallawuk.com. And we hope to see you again next week.